Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a real pleasure to be and privilege to be here. And I checked the information about the group, and I'm really impressed with all those universities and schools. So it seems that we have a really knowledgeable group of people here. But nevertheless, even if I'm going to talk about national contributions to NATO's capabilities from the Polish perspective, I will try to put it into a context, so I won't just start from saying that we need tanks or planes and more of them. Obviously, we need to know why, for example, Poland advocates for having more heavy equipment, for example, and some other countries have been saying, for example, that it's completely outdated and we should invest in something lighter, more deployable. But I would start from two articles from North Atlantic Treaty that are crucial for thinking of NATO, what NATO is today, what NATO can or cannot do. And obviously Article 3 is sometimes mentioned, but not many people remember what it says. And this is very important, that in order more effectively to achieve the objectives of this treaty, the parties separately and jointly by means of continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack. So actually during the Cold War it was all based on individual capacities of nation states. You could move some forces here and there, but there were almost no common NATO capabilities. These were just like, you know, Britons were moving their troops regularly from the island to the continent, a part of the permanently stationed troops in Germany. Americans were having their troops in Germany, but these were just like national capabilities. And of course, every country, especially the border states, also developed their national capacity to be able to defend itself. Okay. They were developing their own national capabilities to be able to defend themselves against the attack, mainly from the USSR and the Warsaw Pact countries. So if you read the history books, you know that there was a huge German conventional army, one of the biggest in Europe, and they really a part of trying to show that NATO is credible, that if NATO fails, so there will be the US response. So there was a huge American presence on the ground, but a part of that, Germany also has been developing a huge conventional army. And Article 5, of course, is fundamental to the collective defense of NATO, that if there is this attack against one country, so it will be perceived as an attack against all countries, and each party, each country will take such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. So again, this is on a general level, most of the people think about NATO and Article 5 guarantees as something ironclad, but this is a political commitment, and as always, nation states, they don't want to be bound by not only political promise, but something more that would require automatic action. There is no automatic action. There is a huge room for maneuver within the Article 5, which means that nation states should help, and they are bound by the treaty, which is the strongest international agreement, but they can choose whatever they want to do to show the solidarity. So some people say that, you know, the strong diplomatic statement would suffice. I don't think that that it would go as only to diplomatic statements, but you also need to give some doubt whether all the allies would really contribute with armed forces, and they would deploy those forces to the country that was attacked. Especially that they may not have those forces, and this is the main thing. So you have Article 5 commitment, but then when you look on the paper, it turns out that there are no troops that actually could be deployed for the support of the country that is attacked or is under the threat of attack. And very briefly about the expansion of NATO, because this is also fundamental thing for our thinking about capabilities, what we actually need. After the collapse of the USSR, and it's just obvious, although again not so many people on average realize this, NATO is a completely different alliance than it used to be, right? Because the existential threat from the USSR and the Warsaw Pact for the US, for the biggest Western countries, disappeared. And their relations with former USSR and present Russia completely changed. So they also wanted to get over the division of Europe, the post-Yalta division, but they also wanted to accommodate Russia and to make it confident that NATO is not an aggressive alliance, that it actually, since there is no existential threat from the USSR, so we treat Russia as a partner. We give a credit of confidence that we can build the relations, and even if we will expand and we will take in new member states, we will not put any significant infrastructure on their territory. And it was a part of the deal written in NATO-Russia Founding Act from 1997. NATO said that it has no intention, no plan, and no reason to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of new members, nor any need to change any aspect of NATO's nuclear posture or nuclear policy, and do not foresee any future need to do so. So this is pretty strong. This is just another political commitment. It's not treaty, so from the legal point of view, it's not very strong. But nevertheless, you have to stick to your words, to commitments. So this one is pretty strong. And another important thing is that NATO also agreed that in the current and foreseeable security environment, NATO will carry out its collective defense and other missions by ensuring the necessary interoperability, integration, and capability for reinforcement rather than by additional permanent stationing of substantial combat forces. It means that to make Russia feel secure, NATO decided, and we all the new member states agreed on this. We wanted to join NATO. This was one of those preconditions. We agreed that there will be no permanent stationing of substantial NATO troops on the territories of new member states, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Baltic states, and later on Romania, Bulgaria. And another thing is that there was also no infrastructure for, although this wording says that it will develop capacity for reinforcement, actually there was no infrastructure that would allow you to admit a substantial NATO forces to your territory if something happened, if there was quite a crisis. So, briefly speaking, since Russia was perceived as a partner, not a threat, so there was no planning. We were not preparing ourselves against any scenarios of including possible conflict with Russia. It was a taboo. We had no infrastructure on our territories which would help you to take in reinforcement, because if there is no, on the paper, the threat analysis shows that there is no threat from Russia or from Belarus, so why would you need infrastructure? And actually there were no crucial capabilities. And this is quite clearly seen in the strategic documents. Again, the average, on average, even the journalists, they don't know how to read the strategic documents, but they really tell you quite a lot. And before 2010, strategic concept was adopted during the Lisbon summit. We could see that in NATO there was actually, let's say, a battle or a discussion. Some countries wanted to give up Article 5 altogether because they said, okay, if we don't face conventional threats and state-to-state conflict is extremely unlikely, so actually maybe NATO should develop more into the direction of cooperative security organization, which will try to build a new security architecture which will include Russia and all other countries, and we will all fight together against modern 21st century threats like international terrorism. And this discussion was quite intense, I must say, and there was a group of countries like Poland and Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary in the V4 format was the core element of this coalition that tried to defend the collective defense and Article 5, and we managed to do it. And the compromise was that NATO decided that from now on we will have three main tasks. Not that the collective defense is the major task, but we will have three equally important tasks: collective defense, crisis management, so if something happens and we assess that it can affect our security in Europe, so we will not refrain from sending our troops out of area. Afghanistan was the first case. No, actually Kosovo was, but Afghanistan was really big. And the third task is cooperative security, which is very often interpreted that we try to strengthen international security. NATO is responsible international actor, and it will try to contribute to international stability by developing cooperation with partner countries, improving their capacity to defend themselves, to contribute to international missions. But this cooperative security was also very much in the spirit of building this common security space with Russia. Yeah, so we had three main tasks, but this was almost 10 years after the attacks against the US, when NATO actually almost gave up on the capabilities that are crucial for territorial defense and for collective defense in the sense of defending NATO territory. Because first, after the collapse of the USSR, in the first years of the 90s, you could see that still countries maintained quite big armed forces, conventional armed forces, because they didn't know what will come out of this anarchy, lack of order in Europe. We still didn't know what will happen with nuclear weapons that stayed in different post-Soviet countries. The Balkans were in turmoil. So up to mid-90s, till the end of the 90s, you could still see that NATO countries maintained substantial forces. But then, especially after September 11 attacks and out-of-area missions, most of the countries started to heavily cut down on conventional armed forces. So it was, if you look at the numbers, I don't put the numbers here, but you could see that in some cases, this is not a NATO country, Sweden, but in some cases, like Sweden, for example, the cuts were like 80%. They Denmark, let's say, they had 2 divisions, so they removed 1 division, and today they have forces that they can put out one division, 15,000 troops instead of 30,000 troops. And it was in most of the NATO countries. From our perspective in Central and Eastern Europe, we were pretty concerned with cuts in the bigger countries that should be responsible for reinforcements if something happened in the region. But still, there was this thinking, and this is where our interests diverged a little bit, that from Polish perspective, as long as Russia is not a democratic country, so you cannot be 100% sure that it will not switch from the peaceful mode into an aggressive mode. So we were usually trying to advocate some caution in those cuts. Other countries, they try to convince us that actually Russia is not a threat and you don't need those capabilities, so relax. We can cut down and make savings, especially that economic situation is difficult. This is actually what is the main driver, how the capabilities are decided, how it is decided what capabilities are needed. That there is NATO threat assessment, and you can see the official part of threat assessment in official documents, in strategic documents. The recent one was that Euro-Atlantic area is at peace and threat of conventional attack against NATO territory is low. Main threats include nuclear and other WMDs, ballistic missiles, cyber attacks, and international terrorism. Then you have the meeting of North Atlantic Council, and they give the political guidance. So they say, okay, yes, we agree that the threat of conventional attack is low, so we need such capabilities. They have this political guidance, and then on the basis of this political guidance, there is the cycle of NATO defense planning process, and NATO officials, NATO specialists in the headquarters, they decide, okay, what capabilities are needed for meeting all spectrum of threats that we consider likely. So if they saw that actually the most likely scenario for NATO will be the out-of-area mission of the type of Afghanistan or Libya, so they pressed on developing these capabilities. We need lighter, more deployable forces that can be sustained some 2,000 or 5,000 kilometers away from NATO territory. And these are completely different troops and forces from those that you need for territorial defense. I followed this, and I was also approached by many diplomats 2 or 3 years ago that tried to convince us that, you know, these are exactly the same capabilities, but these are not actually. The lighter forces is something like you try to invest in a company like 200 people or a battalion 800 people strong, that you have a couple of transport aircraft that you will deploy this battalion, and you will be able to put it somewhere and maintain it for a couple of months. So if you want to deploy this battalion, so it's rather that you need lighter armored vehicles with lighter armor, because it will be easier to transport it, and not adjusted to meet tanks or heavy armored vehicles with bigger guns that you would face in a territorial defense scenario. So this is how it changed. Actually, after September 11, most of the European member states invested in smaller forces, deployable forces, but it just came down to the fact that most of the countries are able to use a couple of battalions, for example, and not bigger units like brigades that would be needed to defend NATO territory, especially against such an adversary as Russia. Of course, NATO said officially what objectives it needs, appropriate mix of nuclear and conventional forces, which is pretty vague, but the very fact that it still says that it is a nuclear alliance, it is again the result of the internal NATO debate, because there were some countries that advocated for unilateral nuclear disarmament. It would be another sign of trust towards Russia. Okay, we gave up on nuclear weapons, so you can feel confident and do the same. These days, it probably seems quite right that NATO hasn't decided to give up on nuclear weapons unilaterally, and it maintains nuclear deterrence, although whether it is credible, it's for completely different discussion, and this discussion is now kicking off in NATO, because we have every reason to believe that it's not very much credible. Then again, the objectives reflecting this adjustment to out-of-area mission is, you can see it here, that NATO decided to sustain concurrent major and smaller joint operations, including at strategic distance, mobile and deployable conventional forces, both for Article 5 and expeditionary operations, and defend against ballistic missile attack. Again, and it's very important because it's in NATO documents, it's written that okay, NATO will remain the collective defense alliance, so it repeats that it will develop those forces. But again, having a light conventional force that is deployable and can be put in the eastern flank quickly is something. It can be so-called reassurance for member states, but if you have a real scenario-based analysis, which shows that Russia can escalate to some higher level even without any provocation, it turns out that NATO would not have necessary capabilities. So I already told you about the consequences of those cuts. There were some gaps in capabilities that showed up, and NATO tried to fill those gaps by creating some common NATO capabilities. This is pretty important because NATO did not have this during the Cold War. Today, there are some NATO capabilities, not only nation states, and we can. The best example is so-called strategic airlift capability. So NATO invested in 3 C-17 Globemaster planes. These are pretty big transport aircraft. Actually, NATO, European part of NATO, funded 2 of those aircraft, and Americans gave the 3rd one. We have also airborne early warning control system, AWACS. These are those nice planes with the saucer on top, very capable radars, and they are really important for taking care of our airspace. Missile defense, very controversial. There is the decision that NATO will develop missile defense system, but actually this was one of those capabilities that most of the countries or some of the countries perceived as provocative against Russia. Again, I will not go into details because it is pretty complicated, but to make it very brief, it boils down to the fact that Russia used the argument from the Cold War that any missile defense system would would change the strategic balance, but actually it refers only to one part of the missile system. The other part, the lower layers of this missile system, do not change anything. It doesn't break any kind of agreement, but it would also somehow change this this agreement that NATO is not prepositioning anything on the territory of the new member states, and it would offer the new member states the capability to defend themselves against not only missile but also air attack. And so this is also why Russia probably was unhappy with this and still is. Another common capability is AGS. So this is the system that gives you operational picture, what is going on the ground. You have unmanned aerial vehicles like Global Hawks that will provide NATO with the operational picture, not only on the territory of NATO if there is need, but also during out-of-area operations, allied ground surveillance system. And this is a brief picture of what we have in the region on the eastern flank. Although I would say that it's very important to, again, know what is behind the numbers. Because when you read Der Spiegel and you look at the map and you see, okay, 5,000 troops in Estonia, in Latvia, Lithuania, altogether not that bad. But then the problem is how many of those troops are really operational combat forces. And this is the most important thing. Estonia and Latvia would be able, and Lithuania, each of those countries would be able to generate a small brigade. That's it. And probably it wouldn't be fully equipped. A brigade is usually from around 3,000. In this case, it would be around 3,000 troops. In case of bigger countries, sometimes it is closer to 5,000 troops. Poland is pretty decent because we have 13 brigades, so Poland is definitely the biggest security actor. And again, when you look at the heavy equipment, those countries do not possess any heavy equipment because their budgets are so low that they just cannot afford it. They cannot afford tanks. They cannot afford aircraft. So this is why we have this Baltic Air Policing mission. The Allies put their aircraft to the Baltic states, and we take care of the airspace of 3 Baltic states. Again, if you look at the numbers in those countries, in Romania, again, combat troops at a very low level, equipment very old and not combat ready. We have some aircraft here, but in Hungary, for example, Gripen aircraft. Recently, they had, unfortunately, two accidents. They lost one aircraft. So to replace it with a new one, it will consume the whole budget for the year for the modernization of the armed forces. So it shows what challenges we have in the region with national capabilities. So, because this is about Polish perspective, so what is behind Polish thinking? First, because we are a border state, we are responsible, as every NATO member state, for our own defense. According to the Article 3 that I showed you, we are obliged to develop our own national capabilities. And this is because that we, as a border state, obviously every NATO member is a NATO territory, so it is, even if we are developing only national capabilities, we could also say that we are strengthening NATO, because if the potential adversary is unable to attack us, to undermine our territorial integrity, so it will not be able to undermine the credibility of NATO. But obviously, we are treating this quite seriously. So we committed to defense spending 1.95%, so almost 2%. It was unfortunate decision that the politicians were not brave enough to agree 2% from the very beginning. But what was good that this 1.95 was written in the bill, in the legislation, so there was no room for cuts. And for the last decade, we have almost 2%. But last year, they found political will to agree that we will increase this defense spending to at least 2% of GDP from 2016. And obviously, from the Polish perspective, a part of strengthening our national defense capacity, it is absolutely crucial to strengthen NATO's ability to act in Article 5 scenarios as a collective defense alliance, but also because there are other priorities, not only collective defense, but this crisis management is one of them. So if you want to be seen as a serious ally that is trying to strengthen the cohesion of NATO, and you know that, okay, for some countries, eastern flank maybe not that very important, but definitely it will be important for them to be able to act out of area. So Poland is also investing in those expeditionary forces, and our contribution to Afghan mission, ISAF mission, was proof. We had, at the peak moment, we had the 7th biggest contingent in Afghanistan with 2,500 troops. So altogether, it is very much driven by our geographical location and also historical experience. But at the same time, we realized that NATO has changed, that there are different interests, that some countries further to the west may not be necessarily interested in investing in capabilities that are good for, you know, conventional conflict, because the major threat for them is coming from international terrorism. So Poland tries to support both, but obviously you understand that this heavy armor will be important in our force structure. And this is one thing, another that I would like to show. When we go into the scenario-based analysis in the region, it will give you some additional knowledge what capabilities may be needed. Again, even before we knew, and on the political level it was not visible, but when you talked to the military guys and some analysts, you also knew that in Germany or in France, in any other bigger Western country that treats security seriously, they were quite aware of the situation that we may be unable to react to the scenarios when the peace area in Europe ends and Russia becomes a resurgent power, and it gets stronger and tries to change the status quo. The problem is mainly with Kaliningrad region, which is heavily militarized, and you have deployed like S-300 missile and air defense systems, which are very capable, comparable to American Patriot missiles. Some experts claim that in some areas they are even better because they can be deployed faster. So you have those S-300 defensive, but it is very important to know that we are talking about capabilities. We know that some of them are defensive in nature, but they can also support offensive operations. Because if you have those systems deployed in Kaliningrad, they actually cover the area, most of the Baltic states and bigger part of Poland, and it means that actually you cannot have the NATO air operations in this area because most of the planes would be simply shot down. Even the 4th generation, Poland has a very capable F-16 aircraft in its newest version, and these different estimates from open sources say that you could lose from 30 to 80% of those aircraft if they were to operate in the vicinity of in the range of those S-300 and S-400, even with the greater range air and missile defense systems. So this is one thing. Another thing is that Russia also may have, or may, it doesn't make any difference actually. They played this game that, or we will deploy Iskander to Kaliningrad. They used it as a threat, but we also knew from the simple analysis that their tactical ballistic missiles were outdated and there is need for replacement, and they will replace it with the new ones. So whether they used threats or not, it was quite obvious that they sooner or later they will place very potent Iskander missiles that you just cannot defend yourself against them, because there is still, the technology is there, but it's just like 50-50. You may shoot one missile, but the other one will penetrate the defenses. And these are tactical missiles, so they are dual capable, so you never know. They may be conventional, but they also may have a nuclear warhead on them. And again, this is the range that they cover. And the consequences of this, of course, we are talking in the Baltic Sea region and the eastern flank. Here in this region with the Baltic states, which are the most vulnerable, so this is why I'm focusing on this part. I'm not talking about Kola Peninsula, which is interesting in itself, but here in this very region, we are talking about the scenarios where you need to think about something happening. I'm not just going into details whether we are talking about hybrid war or open conflict, but if there is need to use reinforcements, there are certain limitations that you will encounter, and you will also encounter the limitations that you need to send reinforcements through the Baltic Sea to the ports in Poland or to the ports in the Baltic states, and all those ports are again in the range of the weapons of potential adversary if the conflict escalates to the higher level. So again, these are all the scenario-based analysis which show that you know, at this level of escalation where you need to send reinforcement and you cannot operate, and for example you are threatened with a real war, what would you have to do actually? If it is a really like a warlike scenario, to be able to operate, you would have to destroy those assets that are located in Kaliningrad and can be located also in Belarus. So you can imagine that from the cold military analysis, when you look at the map and the military guys say, okay, so we have this scenario, and so if Russia escalates to this level that we will need to send reinforcements, so we use those Polish F-16s. They are buying a new weapon, JASM. This is standoff weapon, like cruise missile that can be used outside the range of those missiles for the destruction of the assets. We use them, we destroy them, and then we provide the reinforcement. And then you go with some kind of this scenario to the politician, and politicians say, hey, well, you want to destroy something in the Kaliningrad? this is, you know, this is a strategically important region. They will treat it as a reason for escalation up to the nuclear level, and we will have the nuclear war. So you can see that from the military point of view, and especially when you put it in context with the political point of view, there are huge challenges if the situation became more volatile in this part of region. But nevertheless, we need to prepare ourselves to all sorts of scenarios, and every responsible country is ready to meet all potential levels of escalation, because if you are unable to meet those escalations, so at a certain stage the adversary will tell you, okay, I have this type of weapons, or they don't even need to say it, but they communicate it by exercises, by deployment of troops, and they say, or they send you a message, okay, you are unable to respond to this, right? So now behave and do what we are telling you to do. So this is absolutely important, that NATO has the capacity to meet all the levels of escalations, including the nuclear level, not because we are preparing to attack Kaliningrad or Russia, but just because we don't want to be faced with the situation that even if unprovoked, Russia will try to change the status quo and will try to. We are not talking about the scenarios that, you know, that they will invade and occupy NATO member states. But there was the RAND analysis recently and some more analysis in the States that showed that a part of hybrid warfare, the situation where Russia could try to get a very small part of NATO territory, apparently in Baltic states, could result in fait accompli in the situation where actually NATO is faced with the challenge to reclaim it back, to get it back. Okay, and when you try to get it back, you face this scenario that I already described. You face the scenario whereby trying to just to introduce the defensive operation, just to reclaim the NATO territory, you face the risk of the escalation up to the nuclear level. And this is, and as I say, this base scenario analysis start to appear in open sources, in RAND Corporation made it as well. And it is one of those black scenarios that actually, with these signals that we received after Georgia, after Ukraine, that Russia does not accept the status quo, that it will never agree on any further expansion, not only of NATO, but even European Union and any integration of the post-Soviet countries with transatlantic community. We may have different analysis what is on their agenda, but nevertheless, putting aside, you know, different theories, analysis, and different threat perceptions, it is an absolute must for the defensive alliance that it is ready to defend its territory, because otherwise it can be vulnerable to the undermining of its credibility. And once NATO credibility is undermined, it will stay as a NATO probably, but not as a collective defense alliance, right? It will be a crisis management alliance. We will use it for crisis management operations, but nobody will treat it seriously as a collective defense alliance. And for this region, it will be, again, formally we will be the EU and NATO members, but practically we will be somewhere between the West and the East, with Russia having power projection capabilities to our territories, and we won't have any ability to defend ourselves. So, of course, as I say, and as even Russian officials say, that they are not going to occupy. They are not going to occupy, and it's quite obvious. But it's still not very much comfortable for this region to to be de facto in the Russian sphere of influence, because it would probably lead to this situation. Okay, and this is why Poland, with its size and pretty good economy, tries to maintain the whole spectrum of capabilities. It's one of probably 8 countries in Europe that can afford to have the full spectrum of capabilities, such as land forces, navy, air force, special forces, and by contributing to common NATO capabilities as well. And 13 brigades out of 100 brigades that we have in Europe, actually, combat brigades. It is pretty impressive, and it is appreciated in NATO. Navy is relatively weak because it needs modernization, but there is pretty ambitious modernization program. We have 5 submarines. Most of them are really outdated and they need replacement, but there is a plan to replace them with 3 new submarines. But I will show you the details of the investments in a while. The Air Force is pretty potent with 48 F-16 Block 52 plus. Those numbers matter because it means that those aircraft are really capable of meeting different threats in the air. We also have some post-Soviet, and some of them received from Germany, MiG-29s and Su-22. And special forces, pretty big, even more than 2,000, like 2,500 today. And as I said, we try to contribute to common NATO assets so that NATO is able to run the full spectrum of operations, not only territorial defense, but also out of area. So we contribute to Baltic Air Policing. It's crucial from the Polish perspective that we provide security for the Baltic states. Strategic airlift capability. This is the initiative that some countries just buy hours. We can use on average 150 hours a year of those aircraft. AGS, we contribute to this Allied ground surveillance system. VJTF, so-called Spearhead, recently announced that it will be updated NATO response force, so that the common NATO force that is deployable both to out-of-area operations, but also for the situations that would require fast deployment on NATO territory. So Poland was one of the first countries that said that we'll contribute to this VJTF. There are also other assets, very important, like naval assets. NATO has 4 standing naval groups, and there are 2 groups operating in the north of Europe and 2 naval groups operating in the south of Europe, mainly in the Mediterranean. And one of those groups is very important for the scenarios in the Baltic Sea. This is the mine warfare, minesweepers, because we also, when we think about the reinforcement here in the region, so one of the scenarios is that the Baltic Sea will be just mined, and you won't be able to send reinforcement, or reinforcements will be slowed down. So this is very important that you have the capacity to bring all those troops, the support, but you also need to have ships that will clear off the Baltic Sea from the mines. And you will see that most of the countries in the region, they invest both in anti-submarine warfare, that we are able to detect the submarines and destroy them. But one of the most important assets and capabilities is mine clearing, mine warfare. And these are Polish investments. Recently, like 2 years ago, we announced an ambitious modernization program, although our army has been modernized pretty quickly, especially thanks to our participation in Afghan mission. But in 2013, we announced a 10-year program worth more than 40 billion US dollars. We are investing in those armored transport vehicles. We are going to have 900 of them in cooperation with Finnish Patria, called Rosomak in Poland. And Slovakia announced that it will buy a number of them, and we will produce them together in the coming years. We still rely on the heavy armor like tanks, and we bought almost 250 Leopard 2 tanks from Germany, which are very modern, and also this is a potent capability, although not deployable. We also invest in helicopters, so we have tactical transport on the ground, so the troops can be moved quickly from one place to the other. But it's also important from the point of view of out-of-area missions. In Afghanistan, we saw that helicopters was one of those capabilities that was most expensive, and most of the countries just lacked this capability. And for example, we shared our helicopters with Canadians, that they said that, okay, we send so many troops and we have so many casualties that we are not going to spend money on helicopters, and we shared ours with Canadians. Transport planes, and one of the most recent and most expensive is Patriot air and missile defense system. We are going to have 8 batteries, and this is actually the biggest procurement of this kind ever for Raytheon, for the company that produces these weapons. And also precision-guided weapons like JASM. These are cruise-type missiles that can be launched from our F-16s, but we also have naval strike missiles, and these are the missiles that are placed on the coastline. Again, a cruise type of missiles that can hit the targets in the sea, but also in the land. Pretty tough to detect and to shoot down. So those naval strike missiles, they also strengthen the coastline in case of some scenarios, warlike scenarios in the Baltic Sea region. But all of those investments, first of all, they contribute to the deterrence. So this is a very important factor, that if we don't want to have this nightmare black case scenario, we need to have a real deterrence. It means that you have enough ability and will to act both on the national and coalition level, that just sends the message to any potential adversary that the costs of doing something would be too high, and it will discourage the country from doing something. So this is the major part of my presentation. I would like to leave some time for question and answer session. And summing up, strong national defense, ability to take reinforcements. You will encounter this abbreviation HNS. This is host nation support, and it is absolutely crucial. Even if some countries don't have capacity to have expensive weapons, they can provide support for reinforcements, and they should invest in infrastructure, ports, airports, that they would be able to take in 10, 20, 50 NATO ships, 100 NATO aircraft. This is very important. Ability to support neighbors. The smaller countries have very limited ability to support neighbors. The bigger countries can contribute to this, and Poland is trying to to develop this ability, and it's just obvious that if something happened in the Baltic states, we would send reinforcements. Ability to operate in out-of-area multinational operations with brigade-sized forces. As I said, most of the countries cut down on sizes of troops, and they only have like battalion-size troop that they can force that they can deploy. Poland still maintains the brigade-size forces, and we are able to deploy up to a brigade size troop also, force also. And we are developing growing ability to project power, which is on one hand the deterrence, which would increase the costs of potential adversary and hopefully will discourage any aggressive behavior against the NATO. But it is also very important in the context of out-of-area missions. We saw it in Libya, that even the most potent countries ran out, one of them ran out of precision ammunition pretty quickly. We also saw some countries withdrawing from the mission, and the overall NATO operation lost the power projection capability. So it is very important that even if we will have the submarines with cruise missiles, because this is a part of our modernization program, that these will not only be a modern submarines, but we want to equip them, arm them with cruise missiles. So again, if there is a need to project power, if you want to take part in a operation that will need to exert pressure on somebody, just like it was in the case of Libya, those assets will also be usable and they will be important. And if you go to NATO decision-making body at the table, if you show what assets you have, so then you are the country that can influence what NATO does. Otherwise, you just sit and wait for the strongest, the most influential countries decide. So thank you very much. That would be it. If there are any questions, I am open to answer them.